These regulations were submitted to the state board for first discussion on Wednesday, March 6th. For those that are familiar with the process, this first discussion still allows time for amendments, enhancements, edits. So this is part of the process, and sort of we're fortunate enough to work in a state that allows for such a process. So this work builds off Teach NJ, and to sort of backtrack before we get into it, why is educator evaluation important? And it's sort of always important as we think about this, to start sort of from a macro level and work down to a micro level and thinking what we're doing here in New Jersey. So, the research, the cat is out of the bag. Educator quality is the most influential in-school factor, right? Not class size, not smart boards, not curriculum, not assessments. It's about educator quality. Sort of research over the last decade has proven this, and I think that, with the leaders in the room and the individuals in this room, you would say that you can. Improving student achievement is the most important goal of all of our schools, right? It's why we all wake up in the morning. But it's important to reiterate what we're doing. This is on behalf of our students. This evaluation system is meant to help teachers and leaders continuously improve their practice. We do hear a lot of sort of rhetoric out there that this is going to drive merit pay, or this is just about firing bad employees, and that cannot be further from the truth. We build a system that's predicated on continuous improvement. But then on the same point is, I'm not going to act like this is not a cultural shift. This is an important cultural shift. This is a way to sort of allow schools to better prioritize student-educator growth and decision making. So all change and all paradigm shifts are difficult. This will be difficult. For some context, this is not something that we as a state sort of rushed into. I think when you look across states in this country, as well as sort of other districts in the country, I've sort of delved in. We've been cautious in our approach. This is, 3 years in the making. And the words, when you think about sort of, a consultative, collaborative, these are the words that come to mind. This talks about sort of a task force report that was produced in 2010-11. EPAC group that sort of represents the diversity of stakeholders, many members I see at this group. 2 pilots, the Teach NJ bill passed, Race to the Top, ESEA waiver, external record reports. We've been learning all along the way, right? We have some humility at the state level, saying we don't have all the answers. We want this to be developed by educators for educators. Important as we have this discussion to really bifurcate what's in the Teach NJ law and what's in the regulations. So just to sort of clarify this, the law is something we're all beholden to. So as the DOE develops regulations, we have to work within the confines of the law, right? We think the law, I personally think it was a great step forward. We had the oldest 10-year law in the country, 109 years old, and I think this makes it sort of, it takes us in a step in the right direction. But it's not a perfect bill. So we're working within the confines of the bill. So as you think about this bill, I don't want to read the slide, but a couple things that are important to mention. One is it really drills down on support. The bill talks about support, it talks about continuous growth, it talks about professional development. It actually specifies more so than most sort of state legislation does around evaluation. It's very prescriptive in the sense of timelines, in the sense of number of summative rating categories. And then, of course, as sort of the bill is sort of aptly named in some ways, it really plays into the acquisition and maintenance of tenure. And it's very prescriptive in doing so. So for those who haven't had a chance to sort of go through the bill in detail, and I know reading these things is not only fun, I really suggest you spend some time on it. So as we talk about the bill, we also think about, well, what's going to be the same, right? This is not something to say that, evaluation in New Jersey hasn't worked, right? Evaluation and what we're doing hasn't worked. By almost every measure out there, New Jersey is one of the highest performing states in the country. Annual evaluation of all teaching staff members, that has happened and will continue to go on. We'll have annual summary conferences, annual performance reports, individualized professional development plans. Non-tenured teaching staff will still be required to get 3 observations, and mentoring for novice teachers will continue. So a lot of what we're talking about is not new. This is a complicated slide, and one where it's really worth spending a minute or two upon. The Teach NJ bill defines aspects of the bill that apply to all teaching staff members. But as you drill down into the bill, the provisions of the bill actually affect different groups of educators differently. So it really places a special focus on teachers, principals, assistants, and vice principals, especially when we're talking about evaluation. districts will have considerable discretion for evaluating other teaching staff members. So I'll just let this slide be up here for 1 second, and I think John mentioned this will be available for staff. So as you're sort of, as in my first request in reading the legislation, this is a good sort of companion piece to have with you. So, with all this work, we want to let you know that DOE is committed. Hopefully over the past year and a half, you've seen a level of that commitment through EPAC, through the guidance, through the memos that we put out. But that doesn't stop at regulations, right? Implementation is going to be the difference in this work. And for us, that means getting materials out there, having presentations and trainings, putting out guidebooks, and having a two-way conversation with the field. The last part is the one that I would say, and I attribute Tim and sort of the most of my team for this. We feel we are responsive. We do want to hear from the field. We want to have a productive dialogue. We want people to reach out to us with concerns, suggestions, ideas, right? New Jersey, we're not, a lot of folks, we're not shy, right? We want to have a two-way dialogue in this piece. So let's now get into the regulations, and I apologize for that. So the Teach-NJ Act requires evaluation to include multiple measures of student progress and multiple data sources. So multiple, just to be clear, means two. Again, this is in the law. This is something we are sort of beholden to working within. As we think about new teacher evaluation systems, we're going to talk teacher first and then typically get into principal. We're looking at elements of teacher practice and then outcomes of student performance. And the way we've sort of divided this is to think about teacher practice in terms of observations, we're going to get into that a little more, and then sort of student performance in terms of student growth percentiles, and sort of using the NJS test to evaluate the growth of our students, and student growth objectives. And those are for sort of, those are locally calculated scores that measure an individual teacher's impact on student achievement. And we're going to dive into them a little more, but sort of the equation that you see here computes to a sum-there for you. And that is sort of that's the legend that we're going to use for the next couple slides. So as we think about teacher practice, one thing we decided to do as a state here, and I think that PSA was actually instrumental in some of these conversations, was we were not of the minds that choosing one observation instrument was right for the state. We think the industry around sort of observing teachers and sort of identifying best practices, best teacher behaviors is new. The instruments on the market are evolving, they're growing, and for us as a state to hitch our wagon to one instrument purely for the sake of comparability was not what we heard from educators, right? What we heard from educators and what we followed was, give us a list, give us a menu, give us choices, and hold a high bar for what those are. So we've identified both national instruments as well as locally developed instruments. And districts have been able to learn about these, speak with their board, speak with parents, speak with constituents, and you'll see we had a diversity of choices. It's not shocking that Charlotte Danielson, based on her being a sort of coming out of Princeton and New Jersey person, she has a large footprint in this work. And we think her instrument, like all the others, when implemented properly, can work quite well. So as we think about the protocols go along with the instrument and get into actually implementation, sort of, again, somewhat of a complicated slide, it's tough to deliver this way, sort of all these pieces on one slide. So first, for some definitional pieces, we're talking about long and short observations, and we're talking about formal observations. So we know in the past the word informal observations or walkthroughs have been sort of either prescribed by the state. This is not something we're mandating or asking folks to do. We think informal walkthroughs and formal observations are a great pedagogical practice, but we're not asking for a required minimum number. What we are asking for is, and we're sort of trying to sort of split this in the sense of the different categories of teachers. For all teachers, you're going to receive 3 observations. The duration of those observations is going to vary upon your years of experience. The general theme here is that non-tenured teachers, those that are novice, those that are coming in new, they would, for the most part, on the whole, require more attention. So we're asking for them to have more longer observations. We're asking for them to have multiple observers, the idea of having sort of multiple sets of eyes. And as we get into tenured teachers, and these are folks as sort of the bill sort of take shape, that will have already been deemed effective or highly effective. So we want the principal to be able to spend less time with those folks and more time with folks who need them. And then above all is the idea of a corrective action plan. When a teacher, and this again is in law, when a teacher is struggling and it's been identified as either ineffective or partially effective, which are the other two of the sort of southern end of the rating category, they are prescribed to be on a corrective action plan. which is about supporting that educator and growing that educator. For that to happen, we're asking for one more additional observation and ensuring that multiple sets of eyes. Again, we're thinking it's somewhat of a common sense approach that we heard from EPAC members. Let's spend more time observing teachers that need more help. And then as we get into this, we're asking that every teacher have both at least one announced and one unannounced observation. We think there's sort of merit in the research showing for both pieces, to having a pre-conference, discussing lesson plans, having a prescribed date and class period that you're going to view, but also there's merit to having an unannounced, to come in and see a teacher on a random day, to understand what that teacher does on a day-to-day basis. For a lot of schools that we've talked to, and principals, and many of them in the room, this in some ways is a big yawn. They've been doing this for a while. They've been doing unannounced observations. They've been doing announced. What we're doing is trying to provide some level of comparability in terms of the implementation. So what we've heard, and I guess we're hearing across this stage, well, across the country, training, and more training on this, right? When you think about implementation, if you don't have folks that are properly trained on the tools, know how to use the instruments, and conduct an observation properly, and have a post-conference with meaningful feedback, right? All we've done is sort of set up a sandbox that no one can play. So all teaching staff members being evaluated must be trained on the evaluation. All observers must be trained on the instrument. All observers must participate in 2 co-observations. I'm going to come back to this in a second. And all evaluators must participate in yearly refresher training, with the idea being is that this is like anything else, you know, if you don't use it, you lose it. So each year, folks will be asked to do a refresher training. And then we're asking the superintendent to certify, so there's some level of accountability at that level to say, every one of my observers has been certified. So with the 2 co-observations, which is sort of an interesting practice, and I'd say we as would be somewhat of a leader in the country in this came to us in many ways through EPAC. It was something we were piloting. The idea is that this is double scoring, right? This is double scoring. So the idea is that Kristen, I'm going to just use you as an example because I saw that here. If we were observing Tim Beach, we would go in together. So for every observer, Kristen in her building, she might say, you know what, I have 40 teachers, I'm going to observe 20 of them 3 times, I'm going to have 60 observations. 2 of those 60, we're asking for a co-observation. So we don't think it's a heavy lift, but we think it's a valuable professional development practice. The teacher in the room benefits from multiple sets of eyes. Then the actual observers get to norm with one another. And Chris might say, Pete, what did you see? You know, what did you see in Tim practice? I might have seen something different. And it's a great way to norm on the instrument and calibrate on the instrument. So we think it's a nice professional development opportunity, and at sort of in so many ways, a lesser lift because we're only asking for 2. Again, this was an idea that was pushed to us by educators. So just pausing here, this gives a little bit of an understanding of where we're talking about teacher practice. And what we're going to get to later in the sort of presentation is, what are the percentage weights? How much does teacher practice matter in some summative evaluation? So I'm going to put that on the shelf, but we're going to get there. The next piece is student growth percentiles. So student growth percentiles measure how much a student has learned from one year to the next compared to peers with similar academic history from across the state. I'm going to get into an example of this on the next slide, but I think there's a couple important points. We were fortunate enough that at our state board meeting to have Dr. Tom Kane from Harvard present some of his latest findings on the MED study. There's a couple important points that have really come out. One, right, as in the first slide, is teachers are the most important factor, right? In-school factor in sort of determining school achievement. Number 2 is teacher effectiveness can be measured. It can be quantified. There's an objective component to this, right? They did a study of over 3,000 teachers, a randomized study with all the sort of scientific criteria to show that it can be measured, right? And then there's been sort of partner studies saying these differences really matter. They matter in a student's academic outcomes, and they matter in lifetime outcomes. So I know there's a nice conversation on this. This is an area we want folks to really understand. But the research and science is tough to avoid. So we as a state are trying to leverage that and implement a student growth percentile methodology that's going to be appropriate for New Jersey. So for us, we're going to be leveraging our state test, which is NJPSA, and for those thinking about it, it's only, again, given in grades 3 through 8 in ELA and math. So here's an example, and I'll try and go through this in a somewhat efficient manner, but it is a little bit complicated. So on this slide, we're going to use Albert as an example of a student. So So Albert, who's a third grade student, we're seeing his NJS scaled score increase every year, going from a 150 to a 160 to a 165. Based upon our scaled score and the way that sort of he's identified, he would still be identified as partially proficient, right? So in sort of the achievement level, the absolute level of proficiency, one might look at him sort of in tunnel vision and say, well, Albert is still partially proficient, right? However, we're looking at improvement, not absolute achievement. As you can see by the line trending outward, Albert's actually making significant gains, right? Albert's moved from a 150 to a 160 to a 165. His scale score has improved each year. So as we think about Albert's test history, what we want to do is compare Albert and the students that are in his academic peer group to one another. So these are students who scored similarly on 3rd and 4th grade, and say, you know, how did you guys do in 5th grade, right? How are we looking at academic peers? How are we looking at previous academic achievement, which again, just to sort of fit back to the study that I alluded to from Dr. King, is the #1 predictor. Past academic achievement is the #1 predictor of future academic achievement, right? So it's less than what observations can tell you. It's more than what observations can tell you. It's more than what surveys can tell you. It's how you've done in the past is the best predictor of the future. So using a significant sample size that goes longitudinally back to 3rd grade, looking at academic peers, saying, how did Albert compare to his peers? It's a comparison. So it's not so much the idea as we're thinking about, we can have a separate conversation about how perfect is the NJS. There's no perfect test. The SAT is not perfect, the AP tests are not perfect, the NJS is not perfect. But it's the same measuring stick. So how did Albert compare to his peers, similar academic performance historically on the same measuring stick? And this is showing that Albert came in 70%, right? Every student's given on a chart between 1 and 99%. So according to his academic peer groups, Albert is outperforming 69% of his peers. He's done quite well. As you can see by the chart, he's improved. So as we think about how this rolls up into a teacher, there's sort of the next piece of math here. And again, I'm not a psychometrician, but I'm going to try and simplify this the best of it the way I can. Is Albert's SGP score is then placed on a teacher, we can use Ms. Jones as the example, on her course roster. So to see how Albert has done, right? The idea is that every student counts. And the thinking here is by looking at the median and saying, all right, across our 29 or so students, I don't know the actual number here, let's look at the median, right? Let's look at the 50th student or 50th percentile. Let's look at where the middle student came in and say, that's what we're going to attribute, right? This impresses upon every teacher to make sure they're teaching every kid, right? Because they don't know who the median student is going to be. They don't know if Lance is going to be the median student, or Hugh, or Eve, or Albert, or Matthew. The thinking is we're going to teach every kid. And again, we're going to say, all right, well, from a sort of an average perspective, where is the median, where is that sort of middle student, how did they perform? And that's going to be driving the individual sort of teacher's SGP score. So there's also some business rules here, right? And I'm trying to think we touch upon this. One is that, you know, to be statistically valid, Ms. Jones has to have at least 20 students on her roster, right? So in 1 year, if she only has 12 students and only has 1 year's worth of data, she will not be getting an SGP score. It's unfair and inaccurate to attribute such a score to a teacher. However, over multiple years, that sample size, that N size, can reach 20. So in that first year I mentioned, she only had 12 students, but the next year she had 15 students. But that puts us above the 20 number threshold. So there's sort of, again, a historical piece that we use to talk about sort of, I'll pick up the pace a little bit, talk about sort of how we attribute. Also, students need to be enrolled in the class 60% of the time, and the teachers have to work with those students at least 60% of the year, right? We don't want to attribute anyone's growth or lack thereof to a student or a teacher that wasn't in the classroom for the appropriate amount of time. So one of the things that's worth noting here, I won't harp on this slide too much, is that as we think about historical data, right, all the psychometricians folks, you don't throw data out. The more data you have, the more of an accurate picture you're going to know. So our thought is we want to be fair. And fairness trumps all. So we're thinking about a teacher who might have 3 years worth of data, but in the most recent year they knocked it out of the park, their students really did tremendously well. We want to make sure we give that teacher the highest of the 2 SGP So let me be clear on that. So the 3-year composite rating is lower than what a sort of single year, most recent year rating would be. We're going to give the teacher the highest of the 2 ratings. We want to recognize their improvement, their development, their growth, and that's most evident in this case by their most recent year. I think this slide sort of is somewhat of a duplicate, but the point here to note is that when we think about who this will apply to, this is applying to less than probably 20% New Jersey teachers, right? So we know the ask is given from 3rd to 8th grade math and ELA. The 3rd grade teachers, you don't have a baseline. The 4th grade using 3rd grade. So we're only talking about 4th to 8th grade English and language arts teachers. As we expand new assessments, as PARC comes in, as there might be someday a standardized assessment in physical education, I'm not sure, this is not my area, but as we get better assessments, this tool, this methodology, this level of thinking can be applied across more teachers. So, for those that do not, for those that do not have SGP, and for teachers that do have SGP, we're asking all teachers to have student growth objectives. So student growth objectives, in many ways, are SMART goals. Again, for many principals out there, another big yawn. They've been setting academic targets for their teachers and for their kids for years. So establishing an SGO, a student growth objective, we want to be a collaborative process between a teacher and a principal, with the principal having the final sign-off, so that every teacher knows for a certain set of students, or for all of their students, they're going to have a measurable goal at the end of the year. For teachers with an SGP score, right, these are the 4th to 8th grade, less than 20% of our teachers, they're being asked to set 1 or 2 SGOs in 2013-14. For teachers without an SGP score, they're being asked to set 2 SGOs. So we'll sort of get back into this in all the percentages. So here's just some samples. And in so many ways, some of the questions we get asked are, Pete, do I have to come up with all brand new assessments, right? And our response is, well, how are you measuring your kids now? How are you assessing your students now? How are you assessing your own performance? The thinking is a lot of what's already being done in the classroom in terms of assessments, in terms of portfolios, can easily be transcribed into an SGO, right? This is not about having a perfect measure. This is not about having a perfect assessment. Neither of the two exist, by the way. This is about the idea that student outcomes matter, right? And pushing a culture of student outcomes being at the forefront of all of our conversations. So these are just 2 examples, one for an assessment, one for a portfolio. Both can work. Our goal here as a department is to provide guidance, but really to learn from the field and to get sharing across districts, across schools, say, you know what, I have a great biology SGO. I want to be able to share that across the state. And again, principals can be a huge conduit in that work. So as we think about the weighting of some of these things, which is, again, on the forefront, I'm sure, of all of your minds as well as our educators, how much are each of these pieces going to count? So as we think about 2013-14, 50% is going to be young teacher practice. The observation that, for the most part, many times a principal does is going to count 50%. This is for the 4th to 8th grade teacher. It's the highest weighted factor. Secondly, are the SGPs we talked about. So this is going to count 35%. And lastly, the SGOs are going to count 15%. The SGOs are somewhat new. They're new sort of in the research. There's a lack of comparability, as you might expect when you're talking about 600 districts, 2,500 schools. We want to start small with that. So the thinking would be 50% student achievement, 50% teacher practice. As we sort of learn from the field, we've been learning for 3 years, but our learning's not going to stop. We want to think about introducing different measures and changing weights. Anything you see here as a future target, we're not casting in concrete. We don't know if we're going to get there. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know how long it's going to take us to get there. But what's been impressed upon us from educators is we need to keep learning. There's thoughts around using student surveys, an exciting new area. There's thoughts about having school-wide or cohort-wide measures. So you know what, all the 4th grade teachers get together and they establish an SGO for themselves. So the thinking is there's a lot to be learned here, and we think we're starting somewhat small, and the idea is we're going to move as we learn. For teachers outside of 4th to 8th grade, so this is about 80% of our teachers, we're going to be extremely cautious. We want 85% of their evaluation to be based upon teacher practice and observations. So this has been going on for decades, right? We're trying to, again, make sure the right level of training and right level of sort of protocols go into these observations. We're asking for them to count 85%. And then for the 2 SGOs that I mentioned before, we're asking for 15%. again, we think is a small but meaningful sort of sliver of the pie to think about the culture change that we're going into. The ideal of moving up to 50-50 potentially, and this is what came out of the task force report in 2010-11, we're not ready for it yet, right? We in New Jersey, we across the country, we're not ready for it yet. As we learn more about SGOs, as we learn more about assessments, we might get there, right? But our goal is to focus on 2013-14. So I'm thinking about this, and I'm not going to get too into this slide because I'm probably over my share at the time here. We're looking to compute summative ratings in sort of two important pieces here. One is through a mathematical equation, we're going to have comparability, right? So teachers in Atlantic City and teachers in Tenafly will have a comparability sort of score sheet on this, something we haven't had before. And with the mobility of our teaching staff and mobility of our professional staff, it's quite important because teachers move left and right. So you as principals, as you're hiring, it's good to get a sense of the individual's evaluation as they are actually applying for a job in your school. And then secondly, unlike some other states and districts that went out there, by using a straight mathematical equation, there's transparency, right? This is not a black box where all of a sudden, the department or a district says, you know what, you're partially affected, right? And the teachers there or principals will say, why? So in this case, you'd be able to say, you know what, I really didn't do so well on my observations, right? It was an area that I really sort of had some performance issues. Let's talk about it. Let's make sure that's able to drive my professional growth plan for next year. So again, the transparency and comparability of this is quite important. As we go into it, here's a less than ideal piece, and we want to be again transparent from the department on this. Is that based upon based upon the NJS test, based upon sort of the difficulty of the test, when it's administered, how long it takes to actually grade. For teachers in 4th to 8th grade, those SGP scores may not be available until December or January, right? So this is less than ideal, right? As part comes in, as we get better assessments, as we're able to expedite this, the thinking is, and I hear some, rightfully so, it's less than ideal, right? So the thinking is that as a teacher, I may not know my summative rating, but as you think about the work we're doing, and as you think about sort of best practices, this is not about reaching the ideal states, right? This is about taking a step forward. The alternative would be, let's ignore all the student outcome data. Let's ignore all the SGP scores. When all the research tells us it's the most important or most accurate identifier of historical and prospective teacher performance. So for us, it's extremely important that we do consider these. And the idea is that January will allow us to give some summative rating. It won't be ideal, but having the other elements such as the observation and some of the SGOs back will help drive professional development into the next year, so that process doesn't stop. So again, this timeline is something we hopefully over time are able to compress significantly. So Tim's going to jump into principal evaluation. I think Dan will take some questions, and I know there's some time.
Thank you, Pete. Quickly, it's nice to be back at PSA among so many friends. Thank you, Pat, Deb, and Jen for having us. And nice to see so many familiar faces, particularly members of the Legislative Committee. I worked with you for a number of years. And it's really good to be back in this different role with a whole new array of challenges. So I'm going to go through the elements of principal evaluation. Before I plunge into it, Pete alluded to the MET study, and those of us who are so immersed in this work throw that set of research around a lot. METproject.org is the website. It's the most important research on teacher evaluation out there right now. It's Professor Tom Kane and a whole array of other really smart people doing work in a variety of settings, teaching us a lot about teacher evaluation, and it's influenced our decision-making quite considerably. As we approached making decisions about principal evaluation, we sought to create a system that kept two things in mind. One is we wanted to induce the kinds of leadership behaviors that are important for instructional leaders in schools, and secondly, we wanted to create alignment between principal evaluation and teacher evaluation. We wanted to develop a sense among teachers and administrators that we're all in this together. And I think you'll see that kind of alignment in the 5 components that we have proposed to the State Board for principal evaluation. So quickly, the 5 elements, principal practice, and that parallels the teacher practice instrument. I'll speak about that in a moment. Probably a somewhat new aspect of principal evaluation, even to the field nationally in terms of principal evaluation, is this rubric that we are introducing that creates incentives for principals to get the important work of evaluation done. And I'll go into greater depth on that in just a moment. A school SGP rating, if appropriate for a particular type of school. An average SGO rating based on all the SGOs of teachers in a particular school, and an administrator goal-setting process that really mirrors the teacher goal-setting process, and in fact is very similar to what principals have been doing for years in terms of goal-setting in their individual schools to comply with CUSAC regulations and just good practice in school districts. So the principal practice component, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the choices of your local districts. This is the lens through which administrators will be evaluated. A superintendent will use the lens of a principal practice instrument when evaluating his or her principals. We are proposing a minimum of 2 observations for tenured principals and 3 for non-tenured. And in fact, those numbers actually come straight out of statute. The DOE is not proposing any higher number of observations than is required in statute. Observations may be completed by a superintendent or his or her designee using a variety of information sources, and we've listed some examples. We didn't want to impose a particular template for an observation on superintendents. Your work as administrators and school leaders is very varied, and we wanted superintendents to be able to say, this is the most appropriate way for me to conduct an observation of a principal. The next component is the evaluation leadership component, and this will be a state-developed rubric, and it's in the review process right now. In fact, we have gotten feedback on it on 2 occasions from EPAC, and I know the leadership here at NJPSA is taking some time to go through it pretty carefully, and I've already gotten some initial feedback from them, which has been very helpful to me. The evaluation leadership instrument will be evaluating in 2 domains: building knowledge and collaboration, and executing the evaluation system successfully. So what we wanted to do is to honor the good work of principals who simply get the job done and get the job done well in terms of evaluation. We wanted to put an extra emphasis on this area, particularly in the early stages of this process of building evaluation systems in New Jersey. We know over time, once these processes get institutionalized in school, we want to evolve this component of leadership into other human resource, human capital accountability mechanisms. But at this point, the most important thing we believe for principals and assistant principals is to get the job done and done well when it comes to evaluation. And that's based on the experiences of the 7 states who are already in full implementation of evaluation systems, as well as the experiences of large urban districts like DC, Memphis, Hillsborough County, which is Tampa, Florida. They consistently told us that in creating incentives for principals to get the work done and get it done well is a really important part of this process. 2 other components: school SGP. So principals will be divided among 3 categories for the purposes of evaluation: multi-grade SGP principal, a non-SGP principal, and single-grade SGP principal. So if you have 2 grades between 4th and 8th grade in your school, you will be a multi-grade SGP principal. Okay? So K-8 schools, you principals will be multi-grade SGP principals. If you're a K-4 school, you only have 1 SGP grade in your school. Remember, for grade 3, there's no baseline, so there's no growth score for grade 3. So K-4 schools is a one-grade SGP principal school. And if you have no SGP grades, for example, high school principals, you will be a non-SGP principal. And that's important in terms of the weighting of the components of evaluation, and you'll see those slight differences among principals in those three categories in just a moment when I show you the weighting of the 5 elements of principal evaluation. The SGO average is really pretty straightforward. You take all the SGPs that are developed by teachers in a particular school. At the end of the year, they receive assessments on those SGOs, and the average of that 1 to 4 score for each teacher in the school, the average is then given to the principal as the SGO average. We wanted, again, to create alignment between the goal-setting processes of teachers and create incentives for principals to support teachers in the process of pursuing their student growth objectives. And then the 5th component is administrator goals. And as I alluded to earlier, this is something you're quite used to. I remember one of the most important goals that I set as principal at South Brunswick High School is that we targeted about 70 students, about 10% of our 10th grade and 11th grade classes as students who would benefit from early intervention in order to support their success on the HSPA. And based on our AYP results, it was a very successful goal-setting process. So that's the kind of goal setting that should be built into the administrator goal portion of principal evaluation. So here are the components and the ratings. So as you can see in the shaded portion, the top of this, the weightings are the same. So for all principals, your practice instrument, your observational ratings will constitute 30% of your summative evaluation. For all principals, the evaluation leadership rubric is weighted 20%. So if you're the kind of principal who meets deadlines, gets your observations done, and make sure teachers get good feedback, you can get a very positive rating from this category, and that's weighted 20% of your evaluation, your summative evaluation. And then the SGO average is weighted 10% for all principals. The differences occur among the types of buildings that you inhabit in the area of school SGP and principal goals. So if you're a school with multiple grades that have SGPs, so a K-6 school, K-8 school, for example, your weights will be 30% of your evaluation for SGP and 10% for principal goals. Okay? And you can think about a school SGP in these terms. Take all the kids in your school who receive growth scores, put them in a room, line them up, pick the middle kid. That's your SGP score. Simple as that. And then principal goals will vary. Excuse me, I didn't finish school SGP. So a principal in a K-4 school with 1 SGP grade, your SGP score will be rated to 20% of your overall summative rating. And then principal goals will vary based on the fluctuations in these school SGP scores. So a high school principal will have heavily weighted principal goals because he or she does not have an SGP score. And the difference for multi-grade and single-grade SGP principals will depend on what their SGP score is weighted as. So 20/20 for single-grade SGP schools, 30/10 for multiple-grade SGP schools. And all that adds up to 100%. So this is a different way of representing the same information. You can see, thinking about it from an inputs and outcomes perspective, we really wanted to create a similar weighting between the inputs of leadership and for you being accountable for the outcomes. And we really are shifting, there's no doubt, that we're shifting the process of principal evaluation from an inputs orientation to more of an outcomes. But it's a very reasonable outcomes orientation. And ultimately, as school leaders, I know that you do accept the responsibility for the outcomes of student achievement in your school. You pay attention to the data, You know those kids who are struggling, and they matter to you very much. As an aside, I wanted to say something about assistant principal evaluation. The assistant principal evaluation, we will be releasing an overview of that in the next week or so. And it will follow a similar pattern with the exact same components as principal evaluation. The evaluation leadership rubric will differ slightly because the responsibilities of an AP differs from the responsibilities of a principal. But an assistant principal will be responsible for some teacher SGOs, and then the teachers who are responsible, or excuse me, the teachers who are linked to an assistant principal in terms of an SGO average, well, that will be a local decision. So at South Brunswick High School, we had some assistant principals who were very involved with our English department because this particular assistant principal had an English background. So it will be a local decision about which teacher SGOs will be linked to the assistant principal. Principal goals for an assistant principal can be particular to an individual assistant principal, or they could be the same as the principal in the school. And again, that's a local decision. So the 5 components will be the same for assistant principals, and more information will be forthcoming. Some final items to discuss in relation to the Teach NJ Act is a school improvement panel. And as I spoke to multiple audiences across the state, I know this is one of the forefront concerns on your mind. And one thing that we've already heard loud and clear is that you want very clear and specific support on creating SGOs. You want very clear and specific direction on school improvement panels. We have a draft version of an SGO guide written by a member of my staff who's a county teacher of the year and nationally board certified teacher, and we were getting input from that from some partner districts, and that will be released very soon so that you can use that still this spring if you like for training purposes for your faculties. In addition, and this is more recent feedback, I think I'm going to be the one developing a guide for what should a school improvement panel be doing over the course of a school year. Almost a month-to-month guide on recommendations for what a school improvement panel should be doing. And I think that might be helpful to you. But know that that's guidance. If you as a principal want to enhance particular roles of the school improvement panel, we are going to provide significant local discretion to you to do that. I'm not going to give details on this because you're probably already familiar with it, but the school improvement panel must include a principal, an AP or VP, and a teacher. If there's no AP or VP, then another person can be appointed to take that spot. One thing is, if you choose to build out your school improvement panel, you must retain that a minimum of 1/3 teacher voice. So if you add extra members, you have 6 members, at least 2 of those must be teachers. And I think that's common sense, actually. I think it's very important that teachers have a strong voice as part of every school improvement panel in the state. I think this particular slide answers some significant questions that you may have in terms of the teacher's role on the school improvement panel. Is the teacher allowed to perform classroom observations for the purpose of evaluation? And I always say observations for the purpose of evaluation because I know that sometimes mentors observe novice teachers, and sometimes a struggling teacher may go in and see another teacher who is particularly skilled in a particular area. These are observations for the purposes of evaluation. So 3 conditions for that teacher to conduct observations for the purpose of evaluation. One is the agreement with the majority representative, which is in most cases your local teacher association. The second is the teacher must be appropriately certified to do that, so they must have a supervisory certificate, for example, or an administrator certificate, a principal certificate. And the third condition is that they have to have permission of the principal. This is current practice. You decide who evaluates whom in your schools. So the teacher who is a member of the school improvement panel has to meet those 3 conditions before they're conducting observations for the purposes of evaluation. Probably maybe third on the line in terms of concerns or questions raised or requests for guidance in addition to SGOs and school improvement panel is probably the corrective action plan. And the corrective action plan does have some mandated elements, not too many of them. Again, you know your context the best, but this slide kind of captures what must be some content in corrective action plans. So please note that we do expect the corrective action plans be in place early in the school year following an ineffective or partially effective rating. That's really critical because you want to give teachers the opportunity to operate knowing specifically the areas of improvement that they need to make. I think it's good practice that if a teacher is identified for a corrective action plan in the spring, that corrective action plan is in place before the summer starts, because that teacher would then have the opportunity to address those concerns through professional development during the summer. On our website, we have a variety of materials. You have it in your virtual folder for this meeting. So I encourage you to visit our new website. We are in the process of making it more and more user-friendly. We made leaps and bounds on March 6th by introducing the new website, but I hope you take an opportunity to visit. And remember, every Thursday through mid-April, we are sending out new informational materials about the new evaluation system. So I hope that you take the opportunity to review those materials through the spring, because I know you're very, very busy people, but the more informed you can be, the better feedback you can provide us, and the better that you can implement the new systems. Thank you very much.